and welcome to Media MD, the podcast where each fortnight we prescribe each other a piece of media that we have somehow missed. I'm Reuben Morehouse.
I'm Elliot and Reuben.
And this fortnight we actually have a special guest with us, Victor Rubio from the Digging 6 Feet Under podcast. Hi, Victor.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Good. So yeah, I guess it's kind of a spoiler what you're bringing to us when you run your own podcast about that piece of media. But let's pretend we don't know what you're going to bring to us, and you can introduce it.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, Reuben. So basically, I host the Digging 6 Feet Under podcast, and I break down each episode of the HBO show 6 Feet Under. We're in middle of season 2, but we discuss each episode sort of as if it was airing today.
Okay. So I just want to jump in here and say one thing, which is that I love the name because you have the double meaning of digging, like you're digging 6 feet under. And I just want to say, this is more a question to Elliot. Why didn't we come up with a better name for our podcast?
I think
we have this kind of loose medical theme going on, and it doesn't really, I don't know.
We tried. We couldn't come up with anything better.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah. Well, let's jump into the show. Victor, you want to talk about like why it's great enough that you host a podcast about it?
Well, it's interesting. In the podcasting world, I always wanted to do a podcast, and I sort of never knew where I wanted to put that effort towards. I could have been just another guy who simply turns on his mic and talks about whatever I want to talk about with my friends, but sort of my catch to the 6 Feet Under was I'm an actual funeral director. And the show 6 Feet Under deals with a family who lives in a funeral home around the funeral business. So, being as good as the show is, and, we'll talk about it, it was rather simple on my end to just be like, okay, why don't I talk about this show, which stood this test of time in its greatness. And I just thought, what could be better than that?
Well, people talk about when they're talking about like medical dramas, they talk about like what's the most accurate medical drama. Like people say Scrubs is super accurate and whatever. Mm-hmm. Is 6 Feet Under like accurate to the life of funeral directors?
Here's what's funny about that is that's sort of my hook in the show is where I'll sort of break off from the storyline and I'll be like, hey, they are not embalming the right way, or this is what they're doing. For the most part, the show sticks pretty well. They definitely had some inside knowledge on the funeral industry. They had a funeral director there sort of, had to be shoveling them info because for the most part it sticks to it. There's always some info. Oh, that wasn't even intentional, but man,
we're trying to keep it serious here, Victor. I guess that's something you never really hear about. You hear about like military consultants for whatever, or like police consultants for cop dramas, but you don't hear about like funeral director consultants for these kind of things.
Yeah, and they exist, just like anything else.
Yeah, it's interesting that they got a kind of accurate look at it. All right, so you've talked about the podcast. Let's talk about what is 6 Feet Under.
Well, like I said, 6 Feet Under it takes a dark, humorous look at the funeral business, but more importantly, a family that runs the funeral business. The main setting for the show is the funeral home, and members of the family simply live upstairs. So it takes this, basically, if I was to tell you it's a show about death, and it is, and it's like, well, why would anyone want to watch that? But then what if I said each episode is pretty damn funny because it somehow manages to take death and make it funny. But it's not. It's not campy. It doesn't lend itself too much to fiction. It's rather modern day in time and in the present. That being said, it's a different show. You're not used to. I don't think this is a spoiler of sorts, but each episode starts out with a death.
Yeah.
So that alone is like every time you have someone different dying for a different reason and whatnot.
Right. Okay, so what kind of genre would you fit it into then? Does it fit neatly into a box like a family comedy kind of thing?
I may be overselling the comedy because if that's where your mind went, I wouldn't categorize it as comedy. If I was to, I would go under the dark comedy. But I would definitely categorize it more as a drama. It's definitely more on there's more story, there's more emotions involved than there is anything else.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. I guess I don't know, it kind of seems like it doesn't neatly fit into any box, which just means it's harder to kind of categorize.
Yeah.
So what about the show is the thing that made you say, oh, this is the kind of show I would want to do a podcast about, besides the whole funeral director angle.
The great thing about this show is, and it's why I thought it was somewhat of a safe pick, is this show is really deep, and it makes you question a lot of your own, I want to say life decisions, but what's going on in your own life. So there's always sort of the storyline that's on the surface, but there's always like this net of the idea of death and, your mortality. That's something a lot of people don't talk about, and this show sort of brings it to the forefront. So when I do a podcast episode, I could talk about the story, but I always have this net to fall on where, what are your decisions when you're going to die? Like, have you ever thought about that? What's your experience? Has anyone ever close to you died? How closely do you relate to a character? Because it's quote unquote real life, right? We're talking about a TV show. So there's always that. The show always asks these larger questions, which is something easy to talk about,
Yeah, I guess death is such a weird topic in like today's society, and maybe you as a funeral director have a bit more experience with dealing with that kind of thing than us regular Joes, but I don't know, it's an interesting topic for a TV show to try and like systematically tackle.
And it's weird, I haven't seen anything since, nothing that dealt with the funeral home setting as closely. The creator of the show is Alan Ball, and if you know him, he's done a lot of great TV series and movies. But yeah, I haven't seen anything that's come close to it, in terms of that setting.
Okay, so you would say that it's very much about depicting like people's relationship with death.
Sort of. Like if I had to pie chart it, it's dealing with death, but all you know what? That's a fair statement. It's dealing with death, but dealing it in your everyday life. It's not every day you're thinking about dying, but it's there. The person who dies in that episode sort of lends like the background, the dropscape to that episode.
Well, I'm kind of envisaging it in my head as like there's this core family who run the funeral home, and they're so comfortable with death that it's not like a big deal for them. But then presumably there's people involved with actual deceased who come in and take part in the story from week to week.
Yeah, that's a really, really well synopsis. Yeah, that's kind of exactly how it is.
And then I imagine those people who come in, who are like whatever friends with or family of the person who has died, they have to actually kind of deal with the issues through them in an interesting way.
Sort of too, and since we can't talk about spoilers here, the idea of someone, I'm gonna stutter here because I don't know how to talk about the spoiler for the death lends itself to the episode in more ways than one. I think that's the best way I could put it.
Okay, well we'll come back to that statement after we've watched the show.
So my girlfriend's actually been trying to get me to watch this show for years, so I'm probably going to get in trouble for finally watching it because somebody else told me to. But it goes for quite a few seasons and stuff. Is this something that we should just go to the beginning and watch in order, or are there certain episodes you think we should skip to? Because I think there's too many for us to probably get through in 2 weeks from memory.
Not with that attitude, Elliot.
And that's fair to say because you're asking to cram, 5 seasons worth in a short amount of time. I would say if you wanted, you definitely need to watch the pilot because the pilot is without a doubt the best description of the show. I think you could sort of do like season 1 pilot, season 2 pilot, and then you could kind of go season 3, season 4 finale. And then from there, pick and choose how much of season 5 you want to watch. Because I think, you'll get an idea of the characters and sort of what's going on. You may not know everything, obviously, right? But I think it gives the best description of the capsule of 6 Feet Under.
Well, maybe what we can do is, Elliot, you kind of pick and choose some episodes throughout it. And I'll start from, season 1, episode 1, and just gun it and see how much I can get through. And we'll see whether we have different impressions of the show after that.
Yeah, okay.
Cool. God, I didn't realize it was 5 seasons. I think I need to, I don't know, rethink what I just said.
It's HBO, right? So it's not going to be like 25 episodes a season, surely.
No, they follow the 12/13 episodes a season.
Okay.
That's slightly better than I suppose. Awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, I know that there's a lot of things that I kind of want to touch on with the show, but I feel like we can't get into the specifics of like the show and its relationship with death and all the really meaty stuff until we have actually watched the show, or else you're going to spoil stuff for us.
Yeah, it's sort of hard to do it because we could, once you see the pilot, there's stuff we could grab onto, but if I'm just sort of selling you it without you ever watching it, there's definitely items I have to leave out.
Okay, well, yeah, I guess we'll meet back in 2 weeks and we'll actually have watched as much of it as we can. And we'll talk about it then. All right, so I'll pass us off to future versions of ourselves right now. Thanks, pass to me. Yes, so I'm here to tell you that this next part of Media MD will contain spoilers for Season 1 of 6 Feet Under, as well as some light spoilers for the rest of the show, but not too many. I hadn't watched any more than Season 1, and I didn't feel like the spoilers were too much, but you might want to be careful in this next episode because we do lightly touch on some stuff. If you haven't watched 6 Feet Under, I would highly recommend you do it. No spoilers, but we both quite enjoyed it, Elliot and myself. So we'll wait right here for you to watch it, and we'll see you after the break. And we are back 2 weeks later. 2 weeks. Well, it was more like 3 weeks, but whatever. Yeah, so 6 Feet Under. Before we start talking about this show, I think we should talk about... We mentioned briefly at the end of the last episode we were going to do a little bit of a weird kind of viewing experiment with the order of the episodes. So Elliot, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that was terrible. So I started off basically trying to do the first 2 and the last 2 episodes of each season. The idea being because Victor, you said you really wanted one of us to sort of see the ending. So that was my way to sort of skip to the last season. And I thought I'd be diluting how much I was missing by just sort of skipping the middle of the seasons. But it's a really serialized show, so that did not end up being the case. I was
watching through it. Sorry.
I was starting the second last episode of each season, and I was like, I had no idea what was happening. There were always new characters, and so after the end of season 2, I just skipped straight to season 5 and watched all of that. And yeah, that was sort of much better. But I think to people at home, just watch it all in order. Don't skip anything.
Just watch it in the proper order. Yeah. So I guess since I went through it like in the normal order that a human being should watch it in from the first episode of season 1, I guess I'll give a little bit of a... I want to give a little bit of a plot summary, but first I just want to know, Elliot, like, what do you think happened in season 1 in those episodes that you missed? I'm quite curious to see if you can pick it.
I'll have to remember because I ended up jumping around a bit. I'm trying to remember what was actually at the end of season 1. So Nate had the brain thing at that point, right?
Yep.
And so I guess
that was at the very end.
Yeah. And so I guess his plot had just sort of been him and Brenda had been sort of together and trying to make that work, I guess.
Well, you missed a lot of episodes. Yeah, I changed my mind. This is a boring game. I'm just going to tell you what happened. Basically, each of the 4 characters has their own little arc, right, over the first season. Yeah. So I'll just give the summary. I've just forgotten, Victor. You have to remind me. What's the mum's name?
Ruth.
Ruth.
Yeah. Okay.
Played by Frances Conroy. Yep.
Yes. She was so good.
Tell me,
she was really.
Did you see what happened to Claire's first boyfriend, the one from school who OD'd?
Yeah. So he OD'd and he kind of fell off the wagon a bit, and then his brother accidentally shot himself with a gun, and then he really fell off the wagon. And then at the end of season 1, there starts to be this like. He starts to fall into his old ways and is kind of going into becoming a criminal. Yeah, because that's where season 1 kind of ends.
Okay, because that was like the last I saw of him.
Okay, so let me do my summary. So Claire, that's basically Claire's story. She meets a guy and then nothing really happens with that, and then that kind of starts happening again. She doesn't really have a character arc over season 1 that much. Towards the end, she kind of has some development about like learning who she is and stuff, but her character arc doesn't really go anywhere definitive, I'd say. Yeah,
she's kind of a satellite character.
Because definitely by season 5, like when I skipped to season 5, I could definitely see how, in a lot of ways, she'd sort of become the center, particularly in the finale, without going into spoilers.
I've only seen... I've seen all of season 1 and that's it, so don't jump too much into the ending there.
No, but obviously
get to it unspoiled.
The ending of the finale in particular sort of revolves around Claire a lot more than I thought the start of the series had.
Yeah, which is good. I mean, she's quite an interesting character. It's just that she doesn't really have that much to do at the start, I feel like. Anyway, so I guess we'll go Nate's story. Nate's story is that he kind of comes back and is trying to become a part of this family that he ran away from. And at the same time, it's all about his relationship with Brenda, who is the woman that he meets, and her bipolar brother, who is kind of getting in the way and also quite unhinged a lot. And the series kind of ends with him. The season ends with him being committed and them kind of committing to each other, I guess. And then he also gets in a car crash and has some brain injury. What is it? It's like they find out he has some kind of disease.
Yeah, he has AVM.
Yeah. So then David's story is basically he becomes a deacon at his church, and since he is gay, he kind of is struggling to accept himself in relation to his church. And there's this interesting few moments at the end of the season where in the second last episode, the person who dies at the start, someone dies at the start of each episode. The dead body for this episode is a young gay man who's like early 20s, I think, and he was murdered. He was like a victim of a hate crime.
That was the second last one, right?
Yeah,
that one was intense.
Yeah, and then this David keeps seeing this young man, and kind of he's all beaten up as he was like when he was dead, right? He's all beaten up, and he's kind of like this ghost that keeps haunting David and kind of pushes him to accept who he is and try and like come out as a gay man. And that's kind of David's story, is coming to terms with his faith as well as who he is. And Ruth's story is kind of coming to terms with the fact that she has been married to this guy who died in the very first episode, the patriarch of the family. And she's kind of trying to get out from this just being a housewife and a mother life that she had before, basically. I reckon I didn't like her character that much, but her character was Frances Conroy played her so perfectly, and her character was so well acted. She was just like amazing to watch.
Yeah, well, I mean, because that's interesting, because like hearing you talk about this season 1 arcs is filling in some gaps, which is nice, but
yeah,
it's interesting how different a lot of their season 5 arcs are. Like there was clearly a lot of character growth in the middle that I've just sort of skipped.
Yeah.
Like, so for instance, by the time you get to season 5, David sort of accepted himself a lot more. And that arc is sort of finished. And then it's more about, I mean, at that point, season 5, his arc is really about these kids that he's adopting and sort of how they fit into everything.
We've been talking about the plot for a while. Yeah. I want to jump into what actually makes the show good, and hopefully you'll agree with me on this, Victor. I remember we talked about, when you were describing the show to us in the first part of the episode, Victor, I remember I kind of got the false impression that it's a comedy. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, and so, I mean, obviously the show is a drama, but the very first scene in the show is this kind of very exemplifies its weird dark humor, which is, it opens with this ad for like the new line of hearse, the new model car of hearse, right?
Yeah.
And throughout the first episode, there are all these fake ads for like, oh, this is the newest and latest and greatest like casket. This is, the new embalming fluid that you should be using. And it's relevant to the plot because it kind of sets up this conglomerate that they talk about a bit later. But it's just this weird... The show has very weird sense of humor that comes out at very unexpected times. It's very strange. Like, one of the things I'd talk about, which kind of speaks to the weirdness of the show, is that since there is a dead body, like a death in every episode, in a lot of these episodes, the characters will see hallucinations of the person who has died, and that will kind of guide the kind of moral or their character arc through that episode, right?
But just to make it clear, that to people who haven't seen it, it's not like a supernatural they're seeing them. It's more like it's just a personification. It's more like their
subconscious.
Yeah, it's a personification of their arguments within themselves. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, maybe Victor, you can speak to how accurate that is. Maybe you get hallucinations of the bodies that you're embalming. But
there's a guy I embalmed yesterday who's sitting right next to me. If you want to talk to him,
he's helping you out. Yeah, and it's this like, it's obviously a very weird and surreal thing, but it's played in 6 Feet Under completely for dramatic purposes and completely to guide the character arcs. And I don't know, it's just a very weird and interesting show. I don't know.
I also like...
It's hard to kind of...
I just like the deaths themselves. They're always a sort of interesting way to open the episode, because there was always something odd or bizarre about them. So, like, in season 5, there's this one where this guy's just sort of trekking through trekking along the path, and he stops to take a break, and you're just expecting him to sort of grab his heart and curl over, and then like a bobcat just jumps out and like mauls his face. And then there are other ones.
The one at the end of season 1 is one of the main antagonists in the show, a guy who kind of represents this conglomerate of funeral chains, is talking to his boss, and they're playing golf. And she's about to hit the ball, and then she kind of grabs her heart, and you're like, she's going to die, and then that's going to spur the thing. And then she's like, oh no, that was just heartburn. And then she hits the golf ball, and it flies off and hits some random woman in the head who dies. And it's like this weird fake out where you are like, oh, this person's going to die, and it's going to motivate the plot, and then it kind of just completely pivots away from that. That's another example of the weird sense of humor that this show has, which is, I think, one of its strengths is how it is able to blend the drama and the humor so effectively.
Yeah, but I thought the deaths were really good for sort of covering, like, a lot of the stuff is sort of dealing with the fact of how inevitable and unpredictable death is and all that. And these opening scenes always sort of really highlighted that, because they were all, like, the causes of the deaths were always just so sudden and ridiculous. Or like unridiculous. They were just so normal.
Just to talk about the kind of unexpectedness of death represented in the show, they do this thing where, I don't know if you guys had this same experience, but I would be watching an episode, and the episode, let's say the one just before Claire's on again, off again boyfriend ODs, the episode ends with her finding out that he has attempted to kill himself, right? And since you know in your head the next episode is going to start with a death, there's this very strong thing of like, oh, this is exactly what's going to happen in my head. Like, before I even watch the next episode, I'm thinking, oh, he's going to OD, and that's going to be the death, and then that's how it's going to play out. And every time I thought that, it happened once or twice where they would have these cliffhangers of me expecting to know who the death was going to be in the next episode. I was always completely wrong, right?
They always do intentional misdirects, where it's almost when you start out, it's like, all right, I know somebody's going to die, who and how? And you're like, oh, it's going to be that one. It's going to be this one.
Yeah.
That's funny that you said you had picked up a character. I my entire time watching it, I had never like predicted from a prior episode what it was going to be. But I also kind of have the background of like, I know the I call them the death capsules in the beginning. I know it's always some random person that just has like 5 minutes on screen.
Coming into it, my knowledge was, like, and this was obviously reinforced throughout the episode, was a character dies at the start of someone dies, right? At the start of every episode. And so I was thinking in my head, like, oh my God, this is where they are hinting, like, this is what the death is going to be, and I have to keep watching to find this out. Or there's, at the end of episode 12, the one just before the season finale, Brenda and Nate get into a car crash, and I'm like, fuck, this is going to be the death capsule for the next episode.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be Brenda.
Yeah. And I was wrong. Like, they took it in a completely different direction, which kind of speaks to the message of the unpredictability of death that the show is going for. But I don't know, it was just a really interesting kind of cliffhanger, because it wasn't even set up as a cliffhanger. It was just things that I knew about the show meant that I thought one thing was going to happen, and it didn't. I don't know. It was an interesting reaction.
There's a great moment for this towards the end of season 5. I'll try and avoid speaking of spoilers, but Victor, you're probably aware of the big death I'm talking about, and how they sort of make you they psych you out, I think, multiple times, with how that's going to go down, and then it sort of does right at the end of one of the episodes and leads into the capsule of the next one. And that was such an intense but also calm moment when it sort of went down.
Well, that's interesting. I feel like throughout the first season, the only times they really deal with death are from the perspective of these of the death capsules. I mean, the series starts with the patriarch, their father, dying, and that kind of spirals out through the first 2 episodes of how they're dealing with this. Especially in Claire's story, her dealing with her father's death is kind of one of her core themes for the first season. Outside of that, they only deal with death from an outsider perspective throughout most of the show, and so it'd be quite interesting to see it. Since you just mentioned there is a big death in season 5, I'm assuming it's one of the characters, or Rico or whatever. I think it would be quite interesting to see how they play with dealing from death from an insider perspective, and whether that's different. How they deal with it, basically.
It's funny because I kind of, and I guess you would get this more if you kind of watch more episodes closely. But like, sort of the theme of the Fisher family is how they deal with this heavy thing of death and everything, right? But they're kind of all closed off to each other.
Yeah.
It's like a common theme where like Nate and David, who are brothers, and they do have moments where they kind of say I love you, but it's like placed on a pedestal of how much like they finally get to that point where something as I love you to your brother is just something that should be maybe not said every day, but every once in a while, that's your brother. But being that they work so closely to death, and every episode, any given moment you could die, it's almost they don't talk about it. And they don't quote unquote feel. So
except
it's interesting,
in the last episode of season 1.
Well, right. But I'm saying it's interesting to be like, I wonder how they take it, being that that's what they do. Yeah. Again, spoilers to talk about how they do take it, but it's kind of the thread of the show, or the theme is that this family who all lives in the same house and family business, and they all couldn't be further apart from each other.
Yeah. I think that one of the core strengths of the show is the relationship between David and Nate, or each of the individual relationships between the 4 main characters, right? And maybe Rico, who is kind of an employee of theirs who works with them, is kind of sub to that as well, because they also have quite interesting relationships. But it's just it is a family drama at its core, and the whole engagement of the show is watching how this family relates to each other and interacts with each other in quite interesting ways, and how that develops as well. So, like at the start of season 1, you can tell that they're quite disconnected as a family, but as events progress, Claire does a couple of things where she goes off and like does stuff, and Nate or David find out. And they obviously don't want to tell their mother, and so they kind of cover for each other very naturally in a way that is quite true to how families operate, and it kind of shows them growing together as a family. Or they do a similar thing where Nate and Claire find out that David is gay, and he hasn't come out to them or to his mother yet, and so they don't think his mother will take it very well. They don't think Ruth will take it very well, so they kind of just weave around it. Interestingly, like Nate will say something like, "Oh, how's that girl you went out with last night, David?" And he'll kind of look at David will look at Nate being like, "Shut the fuck up," I just thought it was very kind of it was very real as a show, which made it quite engaging to watch, I think.
Yeah, I thought the 2 words I'd use to describe it were real and raw.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and although there are these kind of elements of like the characters hallucinating or whatever, it's never played as unreal. It's played as, projecting their personalities onto these hallucinations and then kind of developing through that.
Yeah, the hallucinations, I felt they served more as an alternative to internal monologues, really. That's essentially what they are. But they actually, it allows a sort of interactive conversation, which is more interesting.
And kind of works better on a TV show medium than just a character stopping and looking upwards and thinking out loud. So do you have anything else you want to talk about, Elliot or Victor, about the show? Or we can kind of talk about our scores for it and wrap it up.
No, I just like you guys said that it's like an interesting look at a family. And it's funny just listening to you guys who one kind of started it and one kind of ended it. It's kind of funny to hear like both of your takes on it. And it's really interesting because there's so much middle ground that both of you don't have, but you both have like the core points of it, Yeah.
Well, because I mean, starting in season 5, I caught the very, very, or more the aftermath of the whole, I think her name was Lisa.
Right.
But
See, that's
obviously,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah. So I've heard of her name. I never saw her. I obviously know of Maya, but yeah, like it was clear
I
how
have
much.
no idea what you guys are talking
Yeah.
about.
That's so funny to me because if you talk 6 Feet Under to anyone, you say, "Hey, have you watched 6 Feet Under?" Lisa is like top 5 names you would discuss.
Yeah.
But
And
both
so
of you
we
have
both
no
just
idea
have
who
no
she is.
idea what. Yeah.
I know about 3 things about her. But yeah, and it was very
Well,
clear.
don't say
Like
them.
as I'm hearing all this, I'm just like, man, I've missed so much.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, let's talk about Elliot. Are you gonna go back? What are you gonna do?
Yeah, I think I will. Like I said previously, my girlfriend has sort of been pushing this show on me for a while, and so she's keen to sort of rewatch it. So I think we'll just sort of head back to and fill in all the various gaps.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to keep going with the show as well. Like, I really enjoyed it, and I guess we'll segue into our kind of final comments here. I guess, yeah, what we were talking about. It's just like it's a good drama. It's got moments of comedy to kind of break up the drama a bit and keep you invested without getting emotionally drained. You just want to watch this family and kind of the events in their life and see how it happens. It's like a reality TV show, but it's like interesting.
Scripted.
You know? Yeah, scripted. Yeah. Well, the comparison to a reality TV show is stupid, but you just want to watch these characters and kind of their life. It's just a very engaging family drama. So yeah, I'd give it like a 8.5 or a 9 out of 10 for sure.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It's been a long time since just a pure drama show has really drawn me in this much and hit me with the highs and lows that it's trying to hit me with. So I was going to give it a 9 as well.
Well, if you want to fill in the gaps between season 1 and 5, like we've been talking, I host a podcast on the show. I am a licensed funeral director, and I kind of speak a lot on the side of, all the funeral stuff you see when, Nate's downstairs eating a sandwich on the embalming table. I could tell you exactly how gross that is.
Exactly what disease he's going to catch.
And just sort of like, they just sort of stage stuff to look like an embalming, but I tell you, that's not how they're doing, or they're Hollywooding it up. And, we just kind of talk about everything that goes about it. But yeah, like I'm digging 6 Feet Under. And if you search for me on iTunes, you could find me there. I'm on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Podbean, probably some other places I don't know of. And I have a website at diggingpodcast.com. And sometimes when I go on other podcasts, I kind of, like, there's an episode where I talked about the entire embalming process. So just little stuff like that. I just like to inform people about it. So yeah, check it out.
I was listening to some of the Digging 6 Feet Under episodes towards the end of season 1 to kind of get your perspective on them before we recorded. And you had a guest on, I can't remember his name, but he was an author. And you guys were talking about these kind of parade funerals that, like, celebrations that people would have.
New Orleans funerals, yeah.
Yes, New Orleans funerals. And I thought that was very fascinating to find out about all these kind of different funerary traditions that people have. So yeah, I definitely recommend people go check it out.
Yeah, awesome. Definitely.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, and thanks for bringing us 6 Feet Under. It was a real hit.
No, I'm really glad. This was awesome and very interesting. Thank you.
That wraps up another episode of Media MD. Hope you enjoyed it. We enjoyed making it. So if you want to connect with us, we have a website, which is mediamdpodcast.com, and we have a Twitter, which is @mediamdpodcast. Is there something I'm forgetting, Elliot?
Facebook? We have a Facebook.
That's true. We have a Facebook. We have a email address. If you just search Media MD Podcast, I'm sure you can find a bunch of ways to connect with the show. We're getting up there. We're almost at the top of the Google rankings. There's this one podcast that released 3 episodes like 7 years ago, and they're still beating us somehow. But anyway, next fortnight we will be taking a look at the comic book series written by Matt Fraction and drawn by David Ayer, Hawkeye. So tune in 2 weeks to check that out.
I will.
All right. See you then, Elliot.